So, today I'm going to talk about how investing and saving habits can be in your DNA. 7 seconds. Fucking DNA. There we go. I had to use a little bit of verbal lubricant, a little bit of priming the pump with some cursing. Anyway. And after the point where they're sitting there looking at it and they're like, well, it can be technically monetized because I don't want to start a Patreon and I don't want to start doing chat reads or streaming and shit. But anyway, investing is not in your DNA. It is not some unchangeable thing. If anything, there could be habits that are epigenetic, which is things that get carried on that are influenced by the behavior of individuals. And because we have a degree of free will and the choice to make decisions that impact our lives, we can choose to live in a different way that actually carries forward into subsequent generations. But there's certain cultures that have a little bit more attributes that are more primed towards saving and investing. And just before anybody mentions it, I'm not going to talk about the Jews. I'm going to talk about my own personal story being a Scottish individual. So I'm a Scottish American, technically a Scotch-Irish American. So there's a little bit of mix between the two. Very friendly, very, very talkative, but also the Scottish part comes in where there's the stereotype of Scottish people being cheap as shit. And, I think that I acquired those attributes. You see, the Scotch-Irish were a situation where Britain conquered Ireland and decided to go, oh, okay, well, they're mostly Catholic. Let's go ahead and get some Protestants in here. And the only way that they could find enough poor people to go travel to settle in Ireland to make it a little bit more Protestant was through offering a bunch of Scottish people free land in Northern Ireland. And the problem is that a lot of the Scotch people showed up and realized it was a shitty deal, but they were attracted to it because it was free. Some of them went on and did pretty outstanding for themselves and now form a bulk of the Northern Irish middle class and some of the upper echelons of society. But all the poor people decided to move to the colonies, specifically to Appalachia in the United States, where there was very little regulation, an inability to actually collect taxes by the government, and also the land was incredibly cheap because all you had to do was just show up, build your cabin, and claim it for yourself. So these Scotch-Irish people moved to the New World with free land, but the promise of less regulation and less problems. Well, eventually, some of those people, in my own family's story, were enticed by the offer of free land and the opening of Indian Territory, and moved to Indian Territory during the land run when they were giving land away for free for anybody that wanted to actually settle it. And it was, I would say, not that bad of a deal, honestly. In retrospect, it's not that bad. But Oklahoma comes with its own challenges. I will be completely honest about that. But anyway, so a bunch of hillbillies move out to Oklahoma, and that's where my family story begins. So I inherited a lot of my saving and investing habits from my father, who's Scotch-Irish and a bunch of stuff mixed together, and from my mother, who's Finnish. And the Scandinavian and Nordic mindset is be fairly responsible with your money. Indulgences are sinful to an extent, but other than alcohol for some reason. But it's nice to have what is rational and reasonable. But sometimes you can splurge a little bit and have a little treat occasionally. But it lends itself pretty well to living pretty cheaply for the most part. But anyway, so I've inherited both of those cultural attributes from my parents. And now I'm going to get into anecdotes of how I was raised and how kind of cheap my folks were. So my father, for a while we were a single income household because my dad was in the Army, and luckily he was an officer, so he was getting paid reasonably well, but he didn't have to pay for housing because BAH would cover the cost of housing. But he would do things he had a concept of value that he would incorporate into his decision-making process. And so I'm going to give the first story. So my family did go to Disney World when I was a kid. We did make the trip to Disney World, and we took a plane. Now, I was born in 1993. I was 8 years old, and in roughly August, my dad retired from the military and started getting a retirement check. And my mother had just recently started working at a hospital. Well, September 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers and the Pentagon got hit with planes, and suddenly the entire country was scared for a while to go on airplanes. So airfares became incredibly cheap. We went to Disney World when the tickets were the cheapest in the middle of October, when nobody wanted to be there because everyone likes to go during the summer when they're off. And also in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, plane tickets were really cheap. So my dad was saving a lot of money. In addition to that, there was a bunch of cultural fears about a lot of things that were suppressing the market prices for a number of things. So not only did we fly on a cheap airplane, we stayed in a hotel outside of Disney World. October is actually the nicest time of year because it's still warm in South Florida out there, but there isn't that many people going there. So we didn't have the experience of waiting 3 hours in line to go see It's a Small World After All. We didn't have to deal with the lines. In fact, there was barely anybody there because a lot of people were afraid to fly out. And the tickets were cheap. So we also got the opportunity to go on a really kind of bottom-of-the-barrel cruise line, which wasn't bad. We took advantage of the free food. I don't remember my parents really spending any money for the most part. When we went to Disney World, we stayed at a hotel off of Disney World so that we weren't paying the Disney World prices. Because there's the Disney Premium that they sneak into things because people want the Disney experience. And they shill out a bunch of money for something that's ridiculous. But anyway, we packed a bunch of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and a bunch of bottles of water and Diet Cokes. And we went to Disney World. We didn't spend a dime on any food inside of Disney World. And I don't think that we bought any trinkets, but it was a good experience. We got to have a good experience. We also got to visit Cape Canaveral, which was interesting. And we also got to go on a cruise line where we took advantage of the free food. And we didn't spend any tourist dollars when the cruise stopped inside of the Bahamas. It was pretty chill. But that's an example of my parents saving money. The other thing is that my parents were technically middle class. We moved to an area that had a lot of middle class people working in the telecom industry or the defense industry or other things when we moved to Texas. So there were a lot of people that were making a good amount of money and a lot of salespeople that were making a killing off of selling, like our next door neighbor sold medical equipment, made a killing off of that, but they always tried to keep up with the Joneses, and they eventually moved away into a bigger house. We stayed where we were for a while, and I think my parents got their house paid off. They were always putting money away for saving and investing, and putting away for their nest egg and stuff, which is pretty reasonable. I completely commend it because me and my brother didn't really go without a lot of stuff. We still got a wealth of experiences with things. We just had to make our own fun. Our friends got everything that they wanted. They'd go bother their parents about, oh, I want a N64, I want a PlayStation 2. But the truth of the... Let's end that phone call. But the truth of the matter is that, like, we didn't go out without a lot. Now, we did eventually get into, like, airsoft, and we would go to have fun in the woods near our house because there's a lot of undeveloped land and there was a lot of woods in the Texas Hill Country. It wasn't too bad, but every one of our neighbors was buying things like a Ford Expedition or a Ford Excursion or a Chevy Suburban or a GMC, and they were buying these big 7-seater cars. Well, my dad tried to keep up with the Joneses in his own way. He bought a Suzuki XL7, which honestly is the biggest value play of the early to mid 2000s. Because It has slightly better gas mileage than the rest of the vehicles. It was pretty reliable. We didn't have any real issues with it, and it seated 7 people. Now, it had a bunch of quirks that the Suburban and the other vehicles didn't have, but it was a reasonable car for almost $10,000 to $15,000 less than the other cars, because nobody wanted to go and buy a Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7. But that's another example of how my dad saved money. My mom's car was a Mazda Protege, and Mazda is, I'm going to say, always a reasonable car manufacturer. They're always slightly cheaper than comparable cars that you would get with, like, maybe Toyota or Honda. They're pretty reasonable. My dad didn't go for the Kia route because Kias are garbage, and they're only worth as much as the warranty still applies to them. The moment that it's not on warranty, it's a worthless car. But we had a Mazda Protege and a Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7. Pretty reasonable cars. But those cars allowed my parents to save a little bit of extra money, put a little bit more into retirement accounts, and we never went without things, and we never had to worry about our finances for things for a while, which is pretty good. But my dad acquired his saving habits not from his grandmother, who's the one who was raising him, but from his grandparents, my great-grandparents, who were a bunch of Scotch-Irish people that were very self-reliant and did their own thing and had a ranch in southern Oklahoma. Now, how did they get the ranch? My great-grandfather joined the Navy in 1927, and when the Great Depression hit, he was one of the few people in Marshall County that had a reliable source of income. And his wife stayed back in Marshall County for a while. And she ended up buying up land in the middle of the Great Depression, and she sold some of it back to people, but they acquired a good amount of land. And because my great-grandfather continued working for the Navy, he got a commission without a college degree in the middle of World War II, and he retired in 1946. Or maybe 47, I forget. He got military retirement, and then he just basically went back to his ranch, and he did that for a living. Now, he did ranching for one of 3 reasons. Number 1, he was able to buy the land for very cheap, and he was very self-reliant, so he barely had any expenses. Number 2, ag exemptions. Almost every business expense that he would incur, from anything from gas to literally like anything else, or even the cost of electricity or water, he could write off of his taxes. So he paid nothing to Uncle Sam, because fuck Uncle Sam. You want to pay the least amount of taxes possible. I have a different view of it, obviously, kind of inherited from my mother. I feel like taxes, to an extent, are a civic duty. You have to do what you can. But at the same time, you don't want the government to get a hold of money, because the government does really dumb shit. And every single politician in Washington, D.C. is going to come up with little pet projects and rider bills to basically cash checks with the future of this country by printing extra money and devaluing the current money in circulation. But that's a topic for another video. So anyway, he did that, and he put almost all of his money into CDs and bonds at the bank. So when he died, he had a reasonable amount of money saved up, and he did pretty well for himself. But my dad acquired the saving habits from spending those summers with his grandparents, because my grandmother was very much involved in the world of waitressing and bartending, which is very much a live fast, die young kind of mentality that gets bred by those jobs. But they never really went without, because she always managed to put enough money away to save for food and other things like that. She just wasn't there all the time. But anyway, my mom's side of the family was also, there's a degree of thrift that was bred by the fact that my grandfather had semi-unreliable work. He had a union job as a construction site supervisor. he worked for a company for a while, and at some point in the late 50s, his boss offered him, he's like, hey, guess what? You've worked here for a while. You've been doing pretty good. This is back in the day when employers actually gave a shit about their employees. And they said, hey, we'll give you a house. And he's like, well, I'm not going to take a house for free. I'll give you $1 for it. So he bought his house in the late 50s for $1. And ended up doing projects and stuff over the years to it and stuff. But he had pretty good money when he was working, and then he'd take unemployment through the winter, and his wife would go work at a daycare center. Now, they had 4 kids, so I have 2 aunts and 1 uncle, in addition to my mother. But they would always find a way to have food and be responsible with money, and they put a lot of their money into things like savings bonds and just bonds and treasuries in general. And they never really had that big of a problem with money. And eventually, they both hit retirement age, and they both are living off of Social Security and stuff now, and what they've managed to save up over the years. They moved out of Minnesota, and now they've resettled in Southern California to be closer to my uncle. And unfortunately, they're getting hit with California prices for things. They came out to visit me once in Oklahoma, and were surprised to learn that I was only paying $600 for my mortgage on my house, when they're paying like $1,800 a month in rent for a 2-bedroom condo. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, there are a bunch of different ways in which my parents almost made a game of trying to find value, or trying to be thrifty and spend the least amount of money on things. I think the only time that my mother splurges is when she goes to a thrift store or to a Dollar Tree. And my dad is constantly on the search for things that are a good price for things. And I acquired that from him since the age of 7. I've been looking at real estate listings, and I've been looking at car listings, like used cars and new cars and other things like that, getting a gauge on what the prices of things happen to be. So obviously, as inflation has taken hold, I feel like an old man now, because as an example, I was looking at car listings the other day, and I found a 1992 Geo Metro for $2,800, and it had a couple of things wrong with it, but it still ran. Now, $2,800 seems ridiculous to me, because I know when I was looking for a car when I was 16 years old, a 1992 Geo Metro would have sold for about $500. Now, this is, mind you, this is like 2010, roughly 2010, 2009, somewhere in there. So kind of a little bit of time ago, about 15, 16 years ago. But what can you do? They keep printing money, and they keep making everything a little bit more expensive. But I'm still on the lookout for bargains and things that will save you money. I have 1 pair of headphones that I got for $1 off of Temu, and I don't care if Temu items happen to be made with slave labor and Chinese factory labor, with children slaving for 18 hours a day, producing little trinkets and doodads for Western people to get for really cheap prices, because honestly, that seems like a problem that should be addressed domestically by those workers. But unfortunately, they live in a communist country that cares about their workers, as if that has ever been something that's factored into the decision-making of the Chinese Communist Party. But anyway, I'm getting slave labor items for $1. And they work reasonably well, and honestly, they've worked for about a year, and when they break, I'm going to go buy another pair for $1. I really try not to spend any money on a lot of stuff, and it's not that I'm just sitting there trying to be some miserly sort of individual trying to hoard my wealth. It's just I don't really see the need in buying extra shit. Really, I'm content with very little. Honestly, if I get nicotine, coffee, a protein, a carbohydrate, maybe some sugars here and there, and a little bit of fats mixed in, and some vitamins. I'm pretty well set. I'm a very content person. Oh, and if I can drink water too, I'm fine. Like, I don't need that much. I spend most of my free time either engaged in homesteading with my wife in a suburban setting, or I spend my time with reading. I spend a lot of time reading because I'm just always fascinated with stuff. I'm a news junkie. I like following the news. I'm always reading stories about stuff, and I'm always looking at just random things. But in addition to that, I stay physically active. I have a job where I feel like I've accomplished something, and I come home tired, physically tired, so I sleep reasonably well. And I think I'm doing all right. I got 2 kids. That also keeps me busy. And I, for the most part, even though I have some limited enjoyment of things, I feel like I'm very content with what I have, however little it happens to be. But I don't have that many needs, so I don't really feel that weird about it. I don't feel that uncomfortable with my finances and stuff. But really, everyone has to sort of take a philosophical approach and figure out what they need and what makes their life livable. Try to get to the bare minimum. Try to not take on as much extra stuff as possible that's costing them money, and just strip it down to the bare basics of what they need, and then occasionally go out and get some enrichment with some activities out in public, like fishing or walking in public parks or walking their dog, or something that will give them a little bit of enrichment, that they don't have to feel like their life is totally boring. But you just have to analyze your life and examine your life and figure out what you need to get by, to be content with things. And then try not to go for the extra stuff until you can, for certain, afford it. And I think the point where you realize that you can afford things is when you can buy extra stuff and still save money and still buy groceries and still cover your bills. As long as you are able to save a set amount of money, and honestly, if you just save all of the money that you make in excess of things by default, and then just take out what you need as you need it, but make a game of trying to figure out the bare minimum of what you need, that is a better route to saving money, instead of setting a goal for yourself and automatically transferring a set dollar amount and having a little bit left over to splurge with. Because as long as you are able to separate your money into categories of saving and needs, everything else makes a little bit more sense. Anyway, that's my take on things. Y'all have a good day.